This is the Tom Bigby Tales. I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi on the Tom Bigby River called Columbus. And sometimes I write about the rest of the state. This episode is about Ruth Elizabeth Ford and her brother, Charles Henry Ford. Ruth Elizabeth and Charles Henry were the children of Charles N. Ford and his wife, Gertrude. Charles Sr. was a hotelier in Brookhaven, Mississippi at the time the children were born. One of them, I believe, was born actually in Hazelhurst. In 1931, the family lives at the Gilmer Hotel per public records, and Charles Sr. works in the cafe or owns it, and Charles Henry is a cashier at the cafe. Charles Henry was born in Brookhaven in 1908, and he will eventually live to be to the ripe old age of 94 years old in Manhattan, New York. His sister, Ruth, was an actress and a model and a muse to many writers, artists, and musicians, and she will live to the ripe old age of 98, living in the flat just below her brother. Starting in 1965, they were known because they hosted salons for literary creatives, she and her brother, and they welcomed the likes of Mississippi writers Tennessee Williams and William Faulkner, as well as people like Edward Albee and Truman Capote to her apartment in the Dakota Building on 72nd Street in Manhattan. This would be her home for over 40 years. Her apartment would be filled with surrealist art from Russian artist Pavel Chalechu, and I hope that's correct. Pavel was her brother's longtime romantic partner. But Ruth was raised primarily in Columbus, Mississippi. She attended MSCW in Columbus, and during the late 1920s, she would transfer to the University of Mississippi at Oxford, where she earned a degree in French in 1932. In 1933, she earned her master's there at the University of Mississippi, aka Ole Miss, where she would meet William Faulkner, perchance, at the Tea Hound restaurant, where he would compliment her on her classical face structure. Ruth would then go to New York, Paris, and London after graduation to model for great couture houses, and her work appeared on the covers of Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and Mademoiselle magazines, to name a few. She would then go into acting. She appeared in 13 Broadway plays, including Sartre's No Exit and Tennessee Williams' The Milk Train Doesn't Stop Here Anymore. She also took over the role of Blanche Dubois for Uta Hagen in A Streetcar Named Desire, when Hagen withdrew from the play. By 1938, Ruth joined Orson Welles' Mercury Theater and would claim him as the godfather of her daughter, Shelley, who would be born in 1941. Ford married actor Peter Van Eyck and divorced him shortly after the birth of their daughter, Shelley. Soon after, she caught up with William Faulkner in Hollywood, where he was working on a screenplay. And they reconnected as they had been friends in Oxford. And as she was an actress at Warner Brothers, she wooed Faulkner and convinced him to write a screenplay for her. He penned Requiem for a Nun, the sequel to his novel Sanctuary, as a screenplay. The play would not see the stage until 1957, where Ruth Ford would finally portray Temple Drake at the Royal Court in London with her then second husband, Texas native Zachary Scott. The play would later open on Broadway for 43 performances with Ruth and Zachary in their roles. Ruth would reprise her role in Requiem at the Yoknapatawpha Faulkner Conference at Ole Miss in 1987. Ruth's husband, Zachary Scott, would die in 1965 of a brain tumor. For the next 40 years, she conducted salons in her Manhattan apartment. Her brother Charles Henri would invite his friends he had met at Gertrude Stein's Parisian salons. Charles Henri had founded the New York surrealist magazine The View with his Russian lover Pavel in 1940, and he was quite the belle of the ball. Charles Henri became the American surrealist voice in New York's art and literary community. In 1933, Charles Henri, with co-author Parker Tyler, wrote the first proto-queer American novel, The Young and the Evil, about a Bohemian homosexual Greenwich Village community. Charles Henri, while working as a cashier at the Gilmer Hotel in his youth in Columbus, had previously launched his first magazine, Blues, in 1929. The University of Mississippi Archives has copies of all those issues, with the exception of one, I believe. Charles Henri obtained literary submissions from Paul Bowles, Ezra Pound, Edward Roditi, and Gertrude Stein, among others, for his magazine, Blues. He submitted his own poetry for publication in literary magazines and journals such as Transition, New Directions Annual, and The New Yorker. He would move to New York in 1930 from the Deep South, and then would go to Paris, where he became involved in Stein's quirky but popular salons. In Paris, Charles Henri met the artist Pavel Chalitchu in 1932. They would remain together until Pavel's death in Rome in 1957. They allegedly had a publicly explosive relationship. Pavel often referred to Charles Henri as his darling Huckleberry Finn. Charles Henri and Pavel returned to New York in 1936 during World War II, where Ford published his first collection of poetry, a pamphlet of sonnets. In 1940, as the war was really beginning to heat up, Ford began the magazine The View and included the work of European refugees like Andre Breton, Max Ernst, Salvador Dali, Albert Camus, and then the works of Henry Miller and Tennessee Williams. Ford would continue to write and publish and exhibit his work and collections. He wrote the script for Johnny Minotaur, which would later become a film narrated by Salvador Dali and Ginsberg. Ford lived in an apartment in the Dakota directly over his sister Ruth's flat. A documentary was made based on Charles Henri Ford's life, and it was titled Sleep in a Nest of Flames. He died on September 27th, 2002, in Manhattan, New York, at 94 years of age. His sister Ruth died on August 2009 at age 98, outliving her only child, Shelley, who had died 20 years earlier. Ruth Ford left her entire estate, including artwork, her flat, her brother's artwork, and manuscripts, to her Nepalese butler, Indra Tamang. I want to thank you for coming on my tour of the Tom Bigby Tales and some of the people of Columbus, Mississippi. Until next time.